Shelby Wilburn. For our regulars, we're happy to have you back. And for our newcomers, we're excited to have you here with us today for the first time. In this episode, we're celebrating Women's History Month and exploring inclusive leadership. NLI's expert faculty will dive into the positive impact inclusive leadership has on your organization. Now, as I quickly share some housekeeping notes, drop in the comments or chat where you're joining in from today. We are recording today's session, so if you're interested in a replay, be on the lookout for an email later today. That email is also going to include a survey for feedback, as well as a number of resources that are aligned with today's conversation. We suggest putting your phone on Do Not Disturb, quitting out of your email and messaging apps so you can really get the most out of today's discussion. And it's also going to help with your audio and video quality. And we love interaction, so feel free to share your thoughts and comments with us in the chat. Now, to get this show underway, I'm going to introduce our speakers for today. Our first guest for today is a researcher at the Neuroleadership Institute, where she helps clients achieve goals through targeted research and measurement design. Prior to joining NLI, she applied inclusion research to develop leader tools to improve military force readiness. She holds a Master's of Public Health and a PhD in Community Psychology. A warm welcome to the research team's expert on diversity, equity, and inclusion at NLI, Dr. Bridget Lynn. Thanks for being here today, Bridget.
Happy to be here.
Our next guest is responsible for leading and developing the corporate solutions and education facilitation teams within NLI EMEA, ensuring we maintain quality high standards of delivery and generate greater learning insight. Prior to joining NLI in 2003, she had over 30 years of board-level experience within financial services, management consultancy, and recruitment sectors. She is an executive coach with over 4,000 coaching hours and a coach supervisor. She's completed a postgraduate diploma in neuroscience of leadership and holds a degree in business administration. Please join me in welcoming Master Facilitator at NLI, Marcia Smythe. Thank you for being here today, Marcia.
It's a pleasure, Shelby, and I'm really looking forward to partnering.
And our moderator for today is a public speaker who engages on a variety of topics surrounding DE&I, leadership, and women in the workplace, not to mention her TEDx talk on banishing the miscongeniality complex. She's also the author of the book, Would the World Be Better If We Were All Alike? Her expertise in leadership development, diversity, strategic planning, and HR led her to join NLI, where she engages in client-facing consulting and facilitating teams to support organizational programs. A warm welcome to our distinguished faculty of leadership and performance at NLI, Christy Pruitt-Haynes. Thanks for being here today, Christy, and I will pass it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shelby. And thank you, Bridget and Marcia, for being with us today for this, what I think is going to be a really impactful conversation. So with that, let's just jump right in because we have so much, I think, to talk about and unpack and sort of share our perspectives on. So as we all know, this is Women's History Month. And such an important part when we think about particularly women in the workplace is how organizations can really prioritize women in leadership, what people's experiences are in organizations and how that may differ from the experiences of men and things of that nature. So that's a little bit of what we want to talk about today. And, you know, we've all heard all of the statistics on the business imperative of having women in leadership and how that ultimately can actually help the organization function, help it kind of pull things together and deliver better results. But we've also heard so much around women having very different experiences in the workplace than what men do. So part of what we want to talk about today is really dive into the question of how can we keep our talent? How can we retain women? How can we make sure women are moving up in leadership? And how can we make sure the experience they are having and the process it takes to get there is one that is both efficient and effective, but also really honors who we all are at our core? So we want to talk a bit about, and from a neuroscience perspective, we usually look at this through the lens of priorities, habits, and systems. If you know anything about NLI, you've heard us talk about PHS. So we're going to talk a lot about both the priorities and the systems that can help women move up into the world of leadership and make sure that organizations are capitalizing on having women in those roles as much as possible. So the focus of our conversation today specifically being, if organizations are not intentionally moving women up, helping women succeed, are they unintentionally setting women up for failure? And more importantly, are they unintentionally cannibalizing their own results and their own success? So, where we'd love to start the conversation is just a quick thought about what it is we mean when we say leadership. I think we want to do a bit of context and definition setting, if you will. So often when people think of leadership, we think only of people leadership. And do you have a team under you that's reporting to you? And obviously, that's a huge part of it. But there's also the idea of process leadership and project leadership and things of that nature. Bridget, I would love to maybe hear from you, just get your thoughts on your definition of leadership and how the two of those may really come together.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christy. So for me, I have not held a role where I have been a leader of a team. I've had a single direct report in a previous position. However, I do find that I often find myself leading projects or processes that are important for the team. And so for me, when we were first talking about me coming on, I was hesitant, thinking like, am I a leader? Is this leadership? What types of behaviors am I engaging in? And I was so happy to start that conversation with you to say there can be many ways to lead. And so I like that broad definition going into this conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you. And as Andrea stated in the chat, and so well stated, we are all leaders of ourselves. And when we think of it through that lens, each of us do have that responsibility to be a leader, to lead ourselves, to lead processes, etc. Marcia, anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah, thanks, Christy. For me, and I'll just start off by saying I'm in a very lucky position. My grandmother was actually a suffragette, so in the UK. So yeah, I come from a fairly long line of fairly independent women who really believe in us being able to do whatever we set out to do, whatever we want to achieve. Going back to what you said and asked me about leadership, I have to agree with those comments in the chat. A leader doesn't need to lead people or processes. We lead, or anything else, we lead ourselves by our attitude, by the way we are, by what we're wanting to, the goals we set, the vision that we have, and the way that we plan to get there. And as we all know, we're only human. We're not always going to get it right all the time, but it's what we learn and how we then develop and grow. And you know, we're leaders. I happen to have children and I have grandchildren. And I very much believe in at times being the leader in my personal life. I mean, I have a husband and, you know, we're equal partners, but I believe that leadership needn't be about just leading a team, as Bridget said. It's all encompassing. It's what you want to achieve as an individual and how you then set your sights, set your goals, and what you do to try and achieve that. So that's just my view on it, Christy.
Perfect. And I completely agree. And having said that, though, there is still something to be said about women actually being in those what we consider traditional leadership roles. So having departments and individuals reporting under them. And there's so many statistics on when organizations have women in those leadership roles, we see the success of that organization soar. And I think that's where I'd love to take our conversation next, to really talk about some of the realities we're seeing in the workplace when it comes to women. And as we do that, I'd love to get our audience in on the conversation. In the chat, let us know if you feel your organization is really helping or hindering women moving into leadership roles. Feel free to add as much context and background as you would like to that, but would love to know, in your opinion, how is that happening in your organization? Is that a priority you're seeing? Are you seeing women ascending to those traditional leadership roles? Or are there still some roadblocks that we need to move past? Now, having said that, thinking a bit about the reality that we see in so many workplaces. You know, I saw a very, I'll be honest, sad statistic recently that women are leaving, particularly leadership roles, but leaving organizations voluntarily at a rate about 10% higher than men. So we're seeing almost this mass exit of women in leadership roles. At the same time, we know that organizations that have women in leadership roles are more successful. Organizations that have those diverse leadership teams, they perform better. They outperform organizations that don't. So we're stuck with this kind of two-way, this dichotomy, if you will, of we need women in those roles to be more successful, and yet they're leaving. And even the women who are staying within the organization often report that they don't have the same experience around being developed, around performance management opportunities, things of that nature. So when we look at those kind of two very opposite statistics, if you will, would love to know what comes to mind for each of you in thinking about how can organizations either do a better job, or even just why is that our reality? Marcia, any thoughts on the sort of duality of we need women to succeed, yet leaving, and we aren't developing them in the same way, we aren't assessing them in the same way, et cetera?
Yes. I mean, I think we have differences, Christy, between yourselves in North America and in EMEA.
Yes.
And there are also cultural differences between the countries in EMEA. So it's a very mixed bag for us. I'm seeing, or we're seeing through NLI, through our clients in the EMEA region of NLI, that there are a very large percentage of senior people are women. And they're women who have maybe gone up through the ranks, not necessarily in, shall we say, the traditional sectors that we think they'd be in, like HR, for example. We're seeing them, a lot of senior women in finance, a lot of senior women who are in operational situations. I've been very lucky. I've been working with tech company in Stockholm, and they have in their engineering, they have very, very senior women. And they do everything they can to keep them. They allow, so much more time with the families, so much more social time. And they have that which really helps women to stay in those roles. They can see how lucky they are. Now, the other hand is we have other countries where that doesn't happen. And, some of our clients in other areas of Europe are very male dominated, and very few women in senior positions. And there's a lot of, I'd say, toxicity around the fact that, men will maybe go out on I'll say a Thursday night after work, but their assumption in certain European countries is that women have to go home and cook a meal, look after the children, all this, be the homemaker. And in those sort of organizations, it is really challenging to get people to think outside the box, to actually, we're wanting, I suppose, younger people to come in who really are much more open and accepting of the fact that women can do just as good a job at senior leadership levels as men can. Sometimes better, but then I'm biased. That's a bias. But seriously, I think there are differences between yourselves in North America and us in Europe. And obviously I can speak more on the European side for obvious reasons.
Well, and I'm so glad you brought that up, because that is an important thing for us to think about. There are absolutely regional and geographic differences. Yeah. Even here in the United States, there are differences between different demographics that I think we'll talk about a bit more in a moment. But one of the things you brought up that I would love to kind of go a bit deeper with is some of the policies around, or assumptions rather, around what women are doing, especially either in the office or after work, versus what men are doing. And Bridget, one of the conversations you and I were having previously was about those assumptions and how we think men and women are perceived, what we believe they should and shouldn't do. Sometimes the assignments even that are given to women in the workplace versus men, when we think of stretch assignments, can be a little different. Would love to hear your thoughts on how some of those assumptions may be playing into things.
Sure. So for me, a very specific example is I used to work at the Army Research Institute and for the United States Army. And the United States Army is really a hyper-masculine environment that is focused very much on uniformity. And I was a researcher working on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And during my time there, I actually took a really cool course, a red teaming course. And in that course, I was the only female, and I was also the only civilian. So everyone else was uniformed officers, and they were all men. And I actually happened to be pregnant with my second daughter at the time. But I just remember some of the things that used to be said, that, about even going out on a weekend. It was one time they're like, "Oh, what's everybody's weekend plans?" And the instructor looked at me and said, you probably don't have much other than looking after the kids. And, it's just things like that sometimes that I think these societal norms creep into how we view ourselves and each other. And so I think that is an important socio-historical piece of what the workplace is for women right now.
Absolutely. And I think those societal norms and some of those assumptions are having a huge effect on the experience that women have. When we were talking about this episode, doing a bit of digging into research, which we love, we found that about 26% of women have felt either uncomfortable or unsafe due to microaggressions or some form of discrimination within the workplace. And as well as knowing 50% of US employees are women, yet we are still significantly below that when we look at our role in leadership. Bridget, any other thoughts on how these statistics and how that reality may be playing out in the workplace? Or I guess a better question, how those societal norms are showing up in the workplace?
I'll talk about something that I feel really passionate about. And that's the reality women face when they actually step into leadership roles.
Yes.
And for me, I think one of the biggest barriers is that women step into a role and being able to stick to the scope of work that's outlined in the single position that they've been hired for is very difficult. And I have personally seen opportunity quickly turn into exploitation a number of times, which to me, it's an extremely harmful form of performance punishment. And so I've seen really stellar women doing fabulous work being put into situations, and they're given so much work, like an impossible amount of work. And the responsibility that they, under all of it, they begin to crumble because it's too much. And the problem is that they're more than capable of doing all of the things. They can do all of the things they're being asked to do, but all of the things is not what they've been hired to do. And the scope becomes so broad that they're inadequately resourced and their efforts really become diluted and ineffective. And to me, this is when we start talking about PHS. It's really important that we have this clarity and priorities, that we have the habits in place that can check ourselves and what we're asking others to do, and the systems in place to reinforce those behaviors. So for me, a big thing is what's the scope of work for this particular position, and where does scope creep come in, and how do I maintain that?
I'm so glad you said that, because that, it's one of the realities that I think sometimes makes people, and women in particular, second guess if they even want to step into leadership roles, because we've all seen those realities play out. So with that, I would love to take our conversation and ask each of you, and I'll respond as well. What would motivate you to step into a leadership role as a woman? For positions you've had previously, what made you want to go there, and what are things organizations even can do to help motivate you to want to move in that direction? Marcia, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Lovely. Well, historically, I can go back to the early 80s, actually, and I'd had my son. I'd been out of work because we didn't have the ability at that day and age to claim maternity benefit or have time off. And so I'd had my son, and he was 2, and I actually missed work. I wanted to go back to work. Yes, I missed the money as well, but I really missed the work and the work environment. And I was lucky enough, I joined, and this is actually backing up something that you said there, both Christy and also Bridget, a few minutes ago, the feeling that I applied for a job with Hertz Corporation, the rent-a-car and vehicle management company. And I applied for a job that was lower, shall we say, than my capabilities. and lower than what I'd left before. I mean, I hadn't worked for them before, but for the organization that I'd worked before I had my son. And I did it because I had this, why would somebody employ me? Because A, I'm a woman, and I honestly believe that. And B, I've got a little boy and I've been out of work for 2 years, blah, de, blah. I joined them and I actually worked my way up. I was with them for 15 years. And for 7 of those years, I was director of sales, marketing, and client development for them in the UK. I was the only woman at that level within the world for Hertz at that stage. And I did it, and I was really lucky because I'm had my managing director in the UK believed in me. He saw beyond the fact that I was a woman. He saw that I was capable of doing, and more than capable of doing that role. And I do take Bridget's point there of where does this creep come in? I actually wanted it because I loved what I did so much and I enjoyed the company I worked for. I was incredibly lucky. I worked for an American organization that even in that stage believed in coaching. And I was coached. I mean, that's what the management style was. And I have compared everything I've done, every other organization I've worked for, and until I joined NLI, but in between, nothing matched up to the experience I had there, where you have belief, somebody believes you, somebody backs you, somebody knows you're going to make mistakes, somebody never took credit for the work I did within sales and marketing and client development. It was always, you've run that, Marcia, you've done it. And once you've experienced that, it's terribly challenging to be satisfied to work for an organization that doesn't give you that acknowledgement and that feedback constantly. And the three of us realize and know very, very well the importance of acknowledgement and feedback. And that for me is so important in this day and age for women going into leadership roles. Realistic, authentic feedback. I've probably gone a long way around answering your question there, Christy, but I was lucky.
Yes, and you hit on so many critical points, and some of them I want to dig into a bit deeper in just a moment as we talk about some of the things that organizations can do to really show that this is a priority and to really, we always say kind of put your money where your mouth is, so to speak. So no, I'm glad you went there. Thank you for taking the long way around. Perfect response.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Bridget, your thoughts on what it would take and what would motivate you to want to move into kind of traditional leadership roles?
Yeah, I think Marcia really did a great job of saying what I would think would be so important. And for me, that is, as a leader, being able to create the right conditions for people to succeed. And that is what I really feel like is powerful leadership. Setting people up to contribute to their full potential and thrive in the work that they do. That takes a lot of transparency, a lot of thought, clarity and guidance and recognition. I think there's a large piece of engagement that needs to be present. Making sure that you're engaging the people that will be directly impacted by any of the work that you're doing, because they're often the people that will be the most passionate about it as well. It's having the autonomy and ability to kind of really seek out what gives people energy, to figure out what it is that they want to do and what motivates them, and be able to kind of create those conditions and move pieces and parts around. So that, to me, I feel like is what would motivate me to be in a leadership role, is having that greater sense of autonomy and ability to do that.
Absolutely. And I love that you brought up that idea of autonomy and the support. And I feel like what each of you were describing to some extent is the culture of the organization plays such a huge role in not only can you be successful as a leader, but if you even want to. So it becomes really important to think about what is the culture of that organization? What are those systems that we're seeing showing up? I can't wait to move the conversation to when we get to some of those thoughts, because I think that's going to be really important, and we'll look forward to hearing from our audience on those as well. You know, for me, when I think about leadership roles and moving into leadership, it really did have a lot to do with that specific organization. And I will say the other thing that probably helped me some is it takes a lot of confidence. You got to be a little fearless, because we've talked some about the societal norms that are there. We've talked some about the realities that exist, and it takes a certain amount of confidence to say, you know what, in spite of that, I am still going to push forward, and I'm still going to do this. But I think organizations have a huge opportunity to support that confidence and to make sure that they are doing everything to reinforce and letting women know, we got you, you can do this, keep moving ahead. And as we know with all leaders, nobody's going to get it perfect every time. And I think how organizations respond to those mistakes that we are inevitably going to make makes such a huge difference. You know, I've seen and read an article recently that said, unfortunately, when we think about performance management, women tend to be criticized a bit more in performance management, judged a bit more harshly. And a lot of their performance management sort of comments, a lot of the feedback they get are more related to personality traits than work traits. And that should not be. And when we see that happening, it's really kind of robbing women of developing the skills they need, and even knowing how to focus and how to aim their career, if you will, to make sure they have the skills to move up. And I think that's one of the most significant barriers we see in women being successful in leadership roles, is not getting that feedback and not having that support. But from either of you who wants to jump in, any other thoughts on some barriers that we sometimes see existing for women being successful in leadership roles?
Christy, for me, I think we have to acknowledge that there is, again, I'll use the word toxic, a toxic influence of power. And when power gets in the way, you know, people don't want to lose that power. And often that can be seen as, I hate to say it, but, you know, we can be seen as weaker than men. And therefore, people who use power in senior positions can be really threatening to even, you know, a woman at a leadership level. It can still be very threatening if you come across people who use power in a toxic way. And very sadly, I think it is happening in lots of situations.
Completely agree. Completely agree. Bridget, any thoughts on what some of those barriers may be that we haven't touched on already?
Yeah, I think just kind of bringing it all together, the barriers are systems that are set up to reward what society has trained us are the stereotypical successful leaders. And in North America, in the US, we need to look no further than our elected presidents to see what those stereotypes are. What it means to be a powerful leader, a stereotypical kind of view of that. And I think one of the barriers that kind of stands in the way is not only that socio-historical piece, but also there's this piece that I think we'll get into as well. You have the power dynamics, you have the really the oppression of women in society and in organizations that happens because we carry all of these biases with us. And it is not necessarily because we are bad people. It is because we've designed systems that are working exactly how they were designed to work that keep this stereotype in mind. And so I think some of the ways we start to think about how do we, you know, fight back against this, and one of the things we can use is our SEEDS model. Like, what are those biases that constantly creep in that we need to know about and keep in check? And that's a tool, the SEEDS model, that we can use to kind of examine our biases. So I think for me, that's one big thing in organizations is looking at the biases that are embedded in systems and really thinking through what's the stereotypical that I'm pulling to mind when I see somebody filling this position, and how can I make sure that I push back against that?
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And, to add to that, I think another barrier that we see, and this is one that really hits close to home, probably for all of us, is it can be both a pro and a con, but it's the idea of looking at women as a monolith, kind of lumping all women together. And Marcia, I have to credit you and thank you for reminding me, even the way we were having this conversation initially, I have to acknowledge, had a very US centric, North America centric sort of approach. And the reality is, across the world and even across different demographic groups, the experiences that women are having in the workplace, while there are a lot of similarities, some of them are different. So I'd love for us to kind of dive into that a little bit. And to start the conversation, my thought is when we talk about women as a collective group, we then get the benefit of our numbers. We are, at least in the US and pretty much around the world, about half of the population, in some place a little more, a little low. But in general, we're about half the population. So in looking at women as a kind of collective group, we have the power of numbers behind us. So we can come together and we can hopefully push for different changes, different shifts in organizations, et cetera. But there's also a bit of danger in that because different age groups of women are going to face different battles. When women are a bit younger, people may assume, oh, they're going to leave the workplace because they're going to have kids. So the treatment they get could be a little different. Or as a woman of color, when I enter a room and something is you can tell when your spidey senses are tingling and something isn't going the right way, I have to ask myself, is it because I'm a woman? Is it because I'm a person of color? In reality, it's that intersectionality of it. And I think we have to talk about that and maybe look at ways that we as a group of women can support the subsets of women that still exist within our population. So would love to hear any thoughts that you all have. And I have a lot. I could probably fill the hour on the rest of these, but thoughts on looking at women as a monolith versus really focusing on some of those subsets, whether it's by demographic or whether it's by region, that sort of thing. And I just, before I throw it to each of you, would love to just call out in the chat where several people are talking about how impactful and important intersectionality is as a topic. And it absolutely is. And it is a part, or it has to be a part of this conversation. Even the term intersectionality came about when a group of Black women were filing a suit against an organization saying that they weren't being promoted in the same way. And that company came back and said, well, but we have women in leadership and we have people of color in leadership. They just happen to be men. So clearly you're not being discriminated against in any way. And it wasn't until they combined those two demographics that they really saw, oh, we do have an issue that we need to lean into here. So, in thinking about the women as a monolith versus a subset, Marcia, any thoughts on how you've seen that play out in how women are approached in leadership, or whether or not we should look at us as a single group or really pay attention to those subsets? What comes to mind for you when we talk about that?
I absolutely agree with you, first of all, Christy, about the intersectionality. I I often, well, no, not often, that's the wrong word. It comes from our own biases, though, as you said. We carry those with us. I've been working with NLI since 2003. I've seen a lot of facilitators come and go within EMEA and in, North America and APAC, but certainly within EMEA, which is what I'll talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And they come and I'm sort of still there. And so I get to the stage where my intersectionality is, yes, I happen to be white, I'm a woman. Is there something then that comes in because I'm older than the others who are now coming in? So ageism comes in as well. And that's a big thing for women at the moment in the UK. I won't get into the politics of it, but we are women of a certain age in the UK are fighting because we were discriminated against for pensions. if you know anything about it, and I'm not going to go into it and get into the politics, but it was very much, it's against women. It's not against men. And
Mhm.
so we have this, whatever the intersectionality is, I think it comes that well, we know the bias is there in me, which is a very different bias from yours, Christy, because that's my experience and yours
Right.
is yours. As far as thinking about organizations are concerned, I don't think we have, and I have no numbers to back this up, but my feeling is that within EMEA, we do not have the same level of intersectionality that you have as women of color in North America. It's a different level.
Mhm,
It's much,
mhm.
much less. We don't see that as much. I mean, occasionally you see it, but it's not as big as it is with yourselves in North America. I'm going to go back though to what Bridget said a few minutes ago and think about how we do put the systems in place and make new habits, shall we say, to really try and get rid of this intersectionality. I don't know
Mhm.
how we do it. I haven't got an answer for that, but it's not as big for us, I would suggest, in the UK, in EMEA, as it is for you in North America.
Thank you so much for that global perspective. And that does make a difference. And I'm sure that gives you the
Mm,
ability to really work more cohesively as a unit as you're
yeah,
thinking about what we want to see changed and that sort of thing. So I
yeah.
appreciate that. Bridget, oh,
Sorry,
sorry. Yes,
Christy, may I just add something? Sorry,
absolutely.
Bridget, I
That's
apologize.
okay.
Just one thing that I found very interesting. Um, I won't mention the clients, but in EMEA, we have two clients, both very large. One's a management consultancy. I mean, we have lots of clients, but these are just two examples. One's a management consultancy, and one is an energy company. And the management consultancy, and their decision maker was based in mid-Europe, okay, not in the UK. And they specifically asked us for a male facilitator. They would
Mm,
not look at a female facilitator. I was put forward to it because I head up the facilitation team, and they wouldn't even interview me. They would only interview males. We have an energy company based in the UK I'm working with at the moment, and I'm going in there and working with them on unconscious bias and how to become more inclusive, because
mhm,
they are aware that their engineers are mainly young white men. And they're saying, what happens when, and of course they've got the dual thing of being they've got their internal clients because they're engineers, so they're teams, and they have their customers who are clients out in the homes and the factories and everything else. And they're saying we have to instill in these young white men that they're not privileged, that they need to treat everybody exactly the same. And for me, the stark contrast of this energy company versus a management consultancy who should be really in our brains, very well aware of all this, much more aware, and yet they're complete opposites. And I'm sorry, I just wanted to mention that to you because that's the dichotomy we have within Europe. So,
mhm.
just regional.
And I think that's something we probably see around the world. And I think
Yeah.
it really highlights some of the issues that women are still facing in the
Yeah.
workplace in general,
Yep.
and in leadership in particular.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so thank you for that.
Pleasure.
Bridget, I want to go back to you to get your thoughts on sort of the idea
Yeah.
of women as a monolith, as a
Yeah.
unit group versus some of the subsets and some of the differences that we may see, particularly when we think about leadership, depending on various, demographics and things of that nature.
Yeah. So when I think about it, I think even more than there being a downside to not looking beyond the majority, it can actually be harmful.
Mhm.
I think by not looking beyond the majority, we can unintentionally reinforce the status quo, even if it appears that it is changing overall for women in a positive direction. If you don't look behind that and see what's happening for within the group of women, then you can create harm. And so one of the important parts of this is in the diversity, equity, and inclusion work. There was an article that I read that was so important, and that is what happens when white women become the face of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what happens is that we see sometimes there's a positive movement for women. However, we don't look underneath to see how it actually can be harmful to women and people of color, and particularly Black women. Black women often have the hardest time at work in facing biases and barriers. And I think if we don't say that out loud and start to understand why it's happening, then we are reinforcing the systems and holding them in place that continues that behavior. So for me, it is about understanding white is a race. It isn't the reference group of, that we compare everything to. I think it's about understanding that there is diversity. People feel comfort in similarity, but if you are not able to feel discomfort and really embrace what it means to have and be surrounded by diversity, you cannot capture the value. And I think that is an important thing to understand, is that if you are uncomfortable, you are probably growing. It is something you need to do. And I always default to pick up the mirror and then point a finger. And what I see is oftentimes people skip the pick up the mirror part and start pointing fingers. And I feel like that is important in diversity, equity, and inclusion work in particular, because when I start saying things, I like to say, this is what I have done. This is how I've embarrassed myself. This is how I work to fix it. Whereas a lot of times I see people saying, this is what I've seen others do. And I think if we start at home, then that is the biggest part to kind of dismantling these systems and understanding what goes into them.
Very well said. I feel like I should do a standing ovation. So absolutely, absolutely agree. And I think, we've talked a lot about the realities, what women are facing in the workplace, what women, particularly in leadership, are dealing with and navigating, some of those assumptions, some of those societal norms that have been traditionally barriers. But we also know the reality is women are succeeding and it is capable, and there just have to be some things in place to really set us up for that. So where I would love to pivot the conversation to are, what can we do about it? I feel like a lot of this has been very doom and gloom, but there are things that organizations can do to really shift things for the experience that women in leadership are having. So as we start talking about those, I'd also like to throw a question out to the audience. Just so far, what's really resonating for you? Would love to see some thoughts there in the chat. What questions you have, or what really stands out for you? Or what's been your experience as a woman leader in an organization, or as a man who's watching sort of other women move and pivot through the organization? So from what we've talked about so far, I would love to know some of the things that are really sticking out for you and what thoughts it's causing you to have. But as you're putting those in, let's shift our conversation a bit to, how can we change this? What is what's the what that can be done? And, Bridget, I think it was you who mentioned earlier about the importance of PHS and priorities, habits, and systems. And a lot of this for me comes back to some systems work that all organizations can do that help to provide the equity and really prioritize women in the workplace. And I do want to say one call out. So often people can get uncomfortable when we start talking about doing things or targeting one group, kind of lifting one group up. But I'm a firm believer that when you kind of lift from the bottom, everybody rises. So while what we're discussing today may be targeted to moving women in leadership, the reality is having some of these things in place and moving as an organization in this direction really does elevate everybody, while also elevating the results of the organization. So there's a lot of win-wins here. But in thinking of that, some of the things that really come to mind that we can do to elevate women in leadership is something we've talked a lot about: the conversations and the feedback. how essential that is, and how much that can provide the direction that women need when they either are in leadership or are aspiring to get to leadership roles. So, when we think some about the feedback, would love to hear from each of you. What are your thoughts on the kind of feedback we need to be sharing? What is some feedback you've gotten that's been really impactful in your career? What are some things that organizations can do in that way to really prioritize giving quality feedback so women know what to focus on so they can move into these types of roles? And Bridget, I guess I'll throw to you first if you don't mind. I think I started with Marcia last time, so trying to switch it up a bit.
Sure. So for me, the first thing I really think about when I think about feedback is different than like verbal feedback. So what feedback am I receiving in generally speaking, and how does that motivate me? In organizations, almost always there's a level of performance. And so to me, what I like to ask is, what are the reward systems that are put in place, recognizing and supporting and reinforcing? And so I start thinking about, how are we rewarded in our behaviors, and how can we shift from a self-interest reward system, which I think almost all companies and organizations really are anchored in right now, to a public interest reward system, where we're saying it's not about you, it's about we. It's not about yours, it's about ours. And I think that that is a dynamic shift to say, like, we're going to reward behaviors that are all about lifting people up. And so one thing I start to think about is when I hear specific call outs, and this has been in every position I've ever held, I often see the behavior of going above and beyond recognized and rewarded. However, how that is really recognized makes the difference. So when I hear individual call outs in all staff meetings that say something like, I want to thank Bridget for working after hours and over the weekend and on her vacation for helping get to whatever thing, that to me is a harmful recognition and reward that is individual based. Bridget did this. And she, not only that, but then you're reinforcing to everyone that's expected to kind of like work overtime, nights, weekends. So to me, that shift would be in the system saying, I want to recognize this team, this achievement, and all the people that went into this achievement. And they got dirty, and they, did a lot of stuff, and it was tough. They were in the mud together. And so we're going to give them a spa day mud retreat treatment. There's something like that is much different than like a call out and a reward for an individual, but it's like coming together and producing, which almost always is what has to happen, but making sure that everyone is somehow rewarded in that way as a team and a together and a collective. That's good feedback.
Yes, it is. It is good feedback. And that ties us and moves the conversation directly to compensation and reward systems. So having team rewards, as you talked about, is a great way, but also ensuring equity in your compensation and reward systems. We've all heard a million statistics on salary equity and pay gaps and things of that nature. And when organizations kind of lean into transparency around compensation and really prioritize that equity, women see that, and that sends such a strong message to the culture of that company. If an organization says very publicly, we are going to prioritize compensation equity, we're going to do a study, we're going to close any of those gaps that exist for similar positions, that starts establishing the culture as one that truly does prioritize equity, truly does prioritize accomplishments over demographics and identity, and can absolutely send that message that we're an organization who want to see everyone rise, who we want to see everyone kind of achieve at their highest level. So thinking a bit about equity in our systems, what we use to evaluate people who are promoted, how we pay people, that sort of thing can be exceedingly impactful when we think about moving women into leadership roles. And again, going back to the intersectionality piece, making sure we're not just prioritizing one type of woman, but we're looking across the board. So I think equity is another really strong thing we can do. And I have some other thoughts, but before I continue with some of my other thoughts, Marcia, anything that really stands out for you as things organizations can do, particularly on a systemic level, to ensure we're moving in that direction?
Well, I'm 100% with Bridget on what she said there. For me, it starts with not thinking about numbers, not thinking about ratios, not thinking about percentages, not just hiring women because we need to get more women into the organization or whatever it is. That to me is a wrong place to start. There was some research, I don't know, maybe some of you saw it. It was actually in LinkedIn. It was done, I picked it up a couple of days ago. There were some comments by Jay Van Babel and also Zoe Ziani, where they were talking about discrimination in hiring isn't actually that bad at the moment. Where discrimination, and there's lots of evidence to show that discrimination, gender discrimination, persists in other areas. So it's once you get into the organization, and it's salary negotiation, it's career advancement, we know this, and it's workplace dynamics, which goes back to this power thing again. So I'm with Bridget. I think it's about looking at the rewards that organizations give. Is it intrinsic or extrinsic? What is it? Because we're all different, but let's try and get people really thinking about those intrinsic rewards, the bits that give them the satisfaction, not just money, not just a bonus, not just profit share. Yeah, they're important in this day and age, but really getting people to believe in the organization and the organization to believe in them. And with the piece that Bridget shared on feedback, 100%. I also think that what we need, and I know we've done lots of conversations. We did one last week, David Rock, on feedback, but the importance of giving feedback and asking for feedback very frequently, not just waiting. And when I think about myself, the fact that, you know, when I going back to my days in Hertz, that I was, and in fact, my boss now, I report into the COO in Neuro Leadership Institute, and I can go to him and just say, okay, I really want you to tell me after I've done this facilitation or done this meeting, whatever, what it was that worked really well and what I need to maybe rethink for next time. And constantly being aware of then stepping back and saying, okay, that was genuine, authentic feedback. So I can now work with that. So I think the responsibility is on, in this case, what we're talking about, women ourselves, to actually work out the goal of what we're wanting from from the organization, and how we can then work towards being the best we can in that role, with the feedback, the acknowledgement, feeling a part of a team, thinking about, and those of you who know our work here at NLI, the SCARF model, being very well assured, you know, certain of how we can work with people. It's the 5 emotional domains of the brains: status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. I won't go into it anymore now, but I'm sure somebody, maybe Evan, will drop a link into the chat there. So really being aware of that, and organizations thinking about when people are in, not just numbers. Christy, over to you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think something you said really brought up a point for me. So often you'll hear organizations say, we don't have an issue with women in our organization. We're about 50-50. But as you pointed out, it isn't always in the hiring. It's about how people matriculate through the organization. And that's one of the reasons we really wanted to center this conversation on women in leadership, because it is wonderful to have a really diverse organization, but you have to do almost a diagonal slice and look at a cross section of your company. Is that diversity? And in this case, we're talking specifically about women. Is it spread across every level and every department? Or do you see huge concentrations in your entry-level positions, and the higher you go up in the company, the fewer you see? And unfortunately, that's the reality that so many are facing. And I think when we talk about some of these systemic changes, like making sure that there's systems that allow people to move up, making sure that we have equity, making sure that we're giving feedback that is really meaningful and actionable, that's when we can really see the ascension, if you will, of women throughout every level of the organization. And as we talked about, acknowledging, and as Bridget pointed out, saying out loud the differences that occur based on some intersectionality and really prioritizing that. And one last thing as we start to wrap up, I think another thing that we really have an opportunity with is the idea of sponsorship, reaching out to women, whether you are a man or a woman in an organization, reaching out to other women, being a sponsor, saying their names in rooms that they have not yet reached, knowing the skills that they have and looking for opportunities for them to display those skills within the organization, whether that be through stretch assignments, and make sure they're stretch assignments that are actually meaningful and contribute to the bottom line and not just planning the company party. That's important, but we can do more than that. So really making sure that we are being very intentional. In the same way that we say, if you aren't intentionally including, you're accidentally excluding, the same is true here. If we as organizations aren't intentionally prioritizing, intentionally mentoring, and intentionally establishing systems that really help women move through the organization in a meaningful way, then oftentimes we are accidentally doing the opposite. And not only do individuals suffer, but the organization's bottom line suffer. And I think that's something that can resonate with us all. So we are at time. I know we could have kept this conversation going for so long. Bridget and Marcia, I want to thank you so much. To our audience, I want to thank you. Would love to see any final thoughts you have in the chat on what's really standing out for you. But with that, Evan, I'm going to throw it back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you all for thinking with me today. It's wonderful.
Yes.
Thank you all so much for a wonderful, wonderful panel. I greatly appreciate you being here, and I appreciate the in-depth and powerful conversation. I was so excited, as you likely saw in the chat. Folks, I'm Evan McFalls here, just offering a few closing announcements. We have lifted up a poll here so that you can let us know how we can best support you as we close out today's session. In addition to that, just wanted to share a few things coming up. One of which is, if you enjoy these community learning events here at the Neuroleadership Institute, you're going to love our Insider Exchange sessions. Our Insider program allows people to get upfront views into our research and any new innovations that are coming out of the Neuroleadership Institute. It is for senior leaders at at organizations, and you can learn more by following that link in the chat. We are holding our next Insider Exchange next week, so we'd love to see your applications now and begin processing them. The next thing I'd like to know is that we are taking the Neuroleadership Institute's learning events on the road, and we want to partner with you. We are currently soliciting information from companies like yours that are interested in partnering with us. If you'd like to host a Neuroleadership learning event, please fill out the form and the link that was just shared by Tony here in the chat, and we will be in touch with you to discuss what partnership might look like. The next thing I wanted to remind everybody is these episodes of You're in a Brain at Work are recorded. We do send the video after every session. And in addition to that, we also have a podcast. You can listen to this episode and so many more by visiting neuroleadership.com/podcast or checking it out anywhere that you stream podcasts. And with all of that said, there's just one more thing. The Neuroleadership Summit is coming back very soon this October, and we want to hear from you about what you'd like to hear. So if you're interested, please take part in that survey below, and it'll be our pleasure to start taking that into consideration as we build the content for this year, rather. Goodness gracious, it's sooner than we think. And with all of that said, I thank you so much for your time today. You could spend this hour with anybody, and we're so grateful that you choose to do so with us. I'm wishing you a happy weekend, and I thank you so much for your time. Farewell, everybody.